This kind of caregiving that we see from Job's friends is, first of all, beautiful, but it reminds me of our Stephen ministers. There's a book that all of our Stephen ministers know called Don't Sing Songs to a Heavy Heart. And this is exactly what Job's friends come in and do. They don't come in with advice. They don't come in with all of these words. They don't even come in with casseroles. They come in with silence. Job has a heavy heart, and they choose not to sing songs to it. That's a line that actually comes out of the book of Proverbs. Don't sing songs to a heavy heart. When the author and the founder of Stephen Ministry, Ken Hope, wrote this book, he was in the aftermath of the loss of his wife, Joan. She had been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and he had already spent a lot of work creating Stephen Ministry, which was a way for lay people, not only pastors, to be involved in deep caregiving, deep Christian caregiving of people in churches. And so Ken Hope knew a lot about what to say to people who were hurting because he trained those people. He provided for that training. But as he went through his own needs and his wife's needs with her dying of cancer, he found that there were more things for him to learn about what is good help and what is not good help. And he quotes this amazing poem from Shel Silverstein. This poem, there's a lot in this poem, but it ends with, and some kind of help is the kind of help that helping's all about. And some kind of help is the kind of help that we can do without. And I think, have you ever been the recipient of the kind of help that we can do without? Ever been there? And you're just like, thank you, please move along. So that kind of help is what he's trying to teach us through this book, not to give. It's difficult, though. He had to write an entire book about it. He had to do all of this training for Stephen ministers about it, because what do you say to someone who is hurting? The classic advice that we get is to say something like, oh, I'm sorry for your loss, right? That's easy, but then what do you say after that? And all I can think of, by the way, is this clip, which I want to see if I can get. This is what I think of when I think of advice for what to say to somebody who's hurting.
Okay, there's Denham's wife.
Wait, can you bump that up a little bit volume-wise? Thank you.
Okay, there's Denham's wife.
I never know what to say to people at funerals.
No, neither do I. I'm terrible.
Oh, just say, I'm sorry for your loss, then move on. You'll be in our prayers.
Thank you.
Sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
Move on.
Oops! Okay, so don't do that. That's what goes through my head, though. And do you know how problematic that is as a pastor? So I have to hold it back. So what Ken Hope does in this Don't Sing Songs to a Heavy Heart is he actually lists out a bunch of things literally not to say, because there are a lot of them. And I think it's worthwhile to go through them. So I'm going to do that because some of these are counterintuitive. Some of these things sound like they would be helpful. But he did a lot of research, interviewed a lot of people to discover that these are things that people consistently said did not help more often than not. One of them is, I know how you feel. Because even if you think you do, you don't. Every grief is unique. It's for the best. I don't care if it's for the best. I'm hurting. It was God's will. Why would God do this to me? Why did God want this terrible thing? Another thing under it was God's will. God just needed another angel. God just wanted that person. God needed them more than we did. No, that's not how I feel. It's not that bad. Yes, it is. And you can't know that unless you're in my shoes. At least it wasn't this, or at least it wasn't that. It doesn't matter. It was what it was. It could have been worse, maybe. But what hurts is how it was. God doesn't give you more than you can handle. That's a tough one because that is based sort of in Scripture. But I will say the quote that comes from only refers to temptation. That's it. It literally means God won't give you more temptation than you can handle. Not God won't give you more pain, more suffering. If God couldn't give you more than you could handle, none of us would die. Or any should statement. You should never should on people. Enunciation is important. But it's saying should. You should do this. You should do that. That's that advice. This terrible, or maybe good, who knows, advice that people generally aren't looking for in times of hurt. Unless you're literally providing first aid. And so there's all of these things, and we should all be very careful not to say any of these things ever, or we will hurt the people that we're trying to help. And woof, that's hard. So what do we say? I just gave you a list of like 17 things that you can't say. What do you say? I think what you should say is what Job's friends said, which was not much. They were implicitly asking the question, what do you need? Notice how they came to Job. It started with Job's friends heard about the troubles, and then they met together, and then they went to comfort him. So there's a lot of intention going into this. They heard the news, and then they didn't just go on their own. They got together and talked about how best can we help Job. That's why as a church, when something bad happens to somebody in our community, we try to find ways to organize it so that we can come together. And then they went out to console and to comfort. That was their goal. Not to bring Job's family back from the dead, not to raise Job's farm back up, not to treat Job's wounds. Their role was to comfort and console. And what did they do? They sat on the ground 7 days and nights. They wept aloud. They tore their robes. They threw dust in the air. Can you imagine this, by the way? What would this look like? What would this feel like if you were these people? You'd feel probably ugly, right? Don't take a shower. Cover yourself in dirt. Don't wear your best clothes. Tear your clothes. This is the way that people traditionally mourned in that culture, but imagine what that would have felt like. They joined in Job's suffering. This is empathy. The attempt to understand the feelings of another. The attempt to find someone, when you find someone in a pit, get down in that pit with them a little bit and try to understand what they're experiencing. And ask the question, what do you need? It's not about me, it's about you. They did a really good job. But if you remember when I read this story to the kids earlier, the whole beginning of that story was about how Job's friends didn't do a good job. So we know something went biblically terribly wrong here because they now spend like 30 chapters of Job doing everything you shouldn't do. So they start off by being silent for 7 days and 7 nights, but then Job opens his mouth. And he starts this long complaint. He says everything that's wrong, and it's like, why is my life like this? It would have been better not to have been born. Everything is terrible. I have no rest. And so as soon as he's done talking, one of his friends pipes up. And I kid you not, believe it or not, the first words out of his friend's mouth are, no offense, but. And if you don't believe me, in the NRSV it says, if one ventures a word with you, will you be offended? No offense, but have you considered that it's all your fault? And it's not just like that, it's like 2 chapters worth of it's all your fault, and here's exactly why all of your problems are all your fault. You are a terrible person, and you deserve this. Great friends, right? Wonderful people. So, the question is, why would these friends do this to Job? Why would they follow like all of that terrible advice and say all of these terrible things? Because we can't imagine that his friends wanted to hurt him. They were trying to help. That's what people are trying to do when they say these things. They're trying to help. Best intentions. Instead, I think it's that we're uncomfortable. We are, as a society, uncomfortable with silence. We are uncomfortable with pain. We are uncomfortable with discomfort. And this whole book of Job is about being comfortable in the discomfort. Knowing that because things are wrong, it doesn't mean they necessarily can be or should be fixed, depending on the situation. It's complicated. So in the midst of all of this, all these things we shouldn't say, all these things we should do or say, it sounds like caregiving for people who are hurting requires extremely specialized training, doesn't it? It sounds like none of us is capable of doing this. And I mean, you went through CPE, right? So Maggie has great experience doing caregiving, chaplaincy, right? And you do need a lot of training. Like, that was intense training. I only did one unit, and did a lot more than I did. And our Stephen ministers know this too. It's a lot of training to do that. But the truth is that every one of us is capable of caregiving. Because here's my theory. The way you do caregiving best is by not trying to do caregiving. When caregiving becomes the goal, when you're trying to ease someone's pain, when you're trying to increase their comfort, you're coming in with an agenda. And this is what Ken Hoke says. He says, if you come in with an agenda, you're already done. Instead, the best caregiving is done when you bring yourself for the sake of the other person. So there's this theologian that I love named Henri Nouwen. Do any of you know Henri Nouwen? Anybody familiar with that name? Some of you may know him because he came up when we were talking about Mr. Rogers a couple years ago. He's a heavy influence on Mr. Rogers. So Henri Nouwen wrote this book called The Wounded Healer, and everything you need to know is in the title. Wounded Healer. He says that loving and caring, these things, they are a deep human encounter in which one is willing to put their own faith and doubt, hope and despair, light and darkness at the disposal of others. That's it. Caregiving is about putting yourself at the disposal of others. And anyone can do that. And for Henri Nouwen, it's about bringing that wounded self, that imperfect self, who doesn't know the right thing to say, to that encounter fully. His whole premise for his book, Wounded Healer, is that we are all wounded primarily because of loneliness. We've talked a lot about loneliness this summer. We're wounded primarily because of loneliness and isolation. And the primary way to overcome that is through a knowledge of that woundedness that we have and cannot solve. We have to be comfortable with the discomfort. We have to be comfortable with the silence or with the crying baby. To be comfortable with the discomfort. He says that if there is any posture that disturbs a suffering person, it is aloofness. Pretending that we aren't affected. Pretending that we aren't wounded. Pretending that we aren't impacted. Pretending that we aren't human. If we can be anything but aloof, we will be able to give care. Over the past 2 weeks, you may have noticed we've talked a lot about stories from within the LGBT community, and we've done that for a purpose. We're not doing that because the people of the LGBT community are the only ones who experience hurt. Like, obviously that's not true. We all experience hurt. It's part of all of our lives. But we've found, and not just Maggie and myself, but this is actually like all of Christianity has found that Jesus calls us consistently to engage with people on the margins. And the LGBT community is a community that has been on the margin, especially in church circles. And so it's helpful to us as a congregation, as a church, to learn ways to ask the question, what do you need? To learn ways to offer care, particularly to this community. And one of the interesting things, as I've been focusing specifically on this community this month, is discovering that the needs of the LGBT community are not always very different than the needs that I have as a straight person. And so Henri Nouwen is a person who we may never know how he would have chosen to identify himself, but he probably would have identified as a member of the LGBT community, as an asexual or homosexual person. And what he articulated as his greatest need and deepest wound was friendship. He wrote that friendship is one of the greatest gifts that you can experience in life. And one of the quotes that really stuck with me was he said, "When I die, I would like to have someone at my grave whose life is radically altered by my death." That was his great longing. And boy, can I relate to that. You know? Like, that's part of my wound too. I want to have that deep friendship, that deep connection. And for him, I think that wound was especially profound because he wasn't able to share himself fully for fear that it would impact his ministry, which is something that he admitted late in his life. For us, though, that admission that friendship is the wound that most impacted his life, I think that shows us how impactful this work of caregiving is. This work of being the friend that comes alongside a hurting person. This work of listening and having empathy and curiosity. It can make a profound difference in the life of someone who may not even be able to articulate what that wound is for themselves. So may we find the strength to be friends to everyone we encounter, particularly those who are hurting. May we put ourselves at the disposal of others. May we be willing to listen. May we be willing to seek to understand more than to be understood. May we be the kind of help that helping's all about. Amen.